everyone. Thank you. Welcome to the UNA USA 2019 Global Engagement Summit. My name is Rachel Bowen Pittman. I'm the Senior Director of Membership and Programs for UNA USA. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. I just want to remind everyone, please no food or drinks in the General Assembly Hall. We don't want other world leaders to come in and find anything in their seats, so please don't have any food or drinks. Wi-Fi access is available. To connect to Wi-Fi, you'll go to UNHQ Wi-Fi. You don't need a password, just put your name and email, and then you can connect to the internet. Please make sure to turn off all of your cell phone ringers. And also, as you can see, our summit is at full capacity, so please don't put your belongings in empty seats. And most importantly, I think you guys have already started this already, throughout the day, please engage with us on social media. You can use hashtag USA for UN, that's hashtag USAFORUN, tweet at us at UNA USA, and tag us on Instagram. There obviously will be a lot of great moments, so I hope you continue to capture them throughout the day. And at this time, I would like to bring to the podium Kathy Calvin, President and CEO of the UN Foundation. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. You are the champions for the UN, champions for multilateralism, and you are protecting progress. Thank you all for being here today. We've promised you a fantastic day. It's going to start with the Secretary General. It already has. And it will be closed by the President of the General Assembly. I can't wait to see how the rest of the day goes. And I know, Mr. Secretary General, you are going to look out at this audience and see why America is standing tall for the United Nations. 1,900 people in this room from 45 states, 100 college campuses, every corner of our country and every generation, because you believe in the purpose, value, and principles of the United Nations and the work it's done. And beyond this room, it's evident in the 100 or more college campuses that we've opened, one every week, and in the record number of people who will be coming to Washington to carry the message to members of Congress in June. So Tita Banks and all of you, congratulations on what you're doing and what you're going to be doing. So I want to get right to your conversation, Q&A included, with the Secretary General. So I'm going to give you the speed dating version of his leadership. 3 Ps. The first is peace. It's why the UN was created in the first place, and it's the top priority for this Secretary General, who has spent 24/7 in his term thinking about preventive diplomacy, protecting against conflicts, and making sure that we get to a peaceful planet. Second is parity. When it comes to supporting women, this guy really walks the talk. Under his leadership, for the first time ever, the UN senior leadership has gender parity, and there's gender parity in all the resident coordinators around the world. And he's just getting started. And the third P is planet. You know, not every climate crusader wears a cape. Some of them wear a suit and tie when they go to work to fight for our planet. And this Secretary General has shown he knows how to be the top diplomat, urging us all for more ambition and urgent action on climate and making this a better world. We are so grateful, and you're going to hear more about his plans for that today. And I guess there's one more P, Portugal. This is the first Secretary General who also served as the head of state from his home country of Portugal. And I'm so proud that we're here with him today. Please join me in giving a very big UNA welcome to António Guterres.
Dear friends, may I suggest, there were many possibilities of photos with some of you, but not with all of you. So if you don't mind, before I start, I will go there to the first row and ask one of our photographers to take a picture of the whole group, including me, okay? dear friends, it was indeed a great honor to be member of the USA for UN. Welcome to the United Nations. And I'm very grateful to Kathy Calvin and the UN Foundation for making this happen. And I also thank Teta Banks and the leadership of the United Nations Association of the United States. And I want to congratulate you on the 75th anniversary. And we will have next year the commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And I hope there will be lots of occasions for interaction with the peoples of the world, starting by the people of the United States of America, in order for the UN to be able to reform and to be more able to respond to the aspirations and the needs of the peoples of this world. Now, before we start our conversation, allow me to make 3 very quick points. First, and a simple thank you to you all as Americans. Even at the height of the Second World War, USA's founders knew that grassroots American support would be essential to create an organization that could win the peace. And among them was Eleanor Roosevelt, who had such a profound influence in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and who worked so hard to build your organization after she retired as US Ambassador to the General Assembly. And throughout the history of the United Nations, since its founding in San Francisco in 1945, the United States leadership and generosity have always been indispensable. It is no coincidence that the first words of the UN Charter, "We the peoples," echo the US Constitution. I believe the US Constitution starts by "We the people." Here it's "We the peoples," but it's the same inspiration. And I recall from my time as High Commissioner for Refugees the importance of US support, the largest donor in humanitarian aid around the world, the largest contributor to the United Nations core budget and to our peacekeeping operations. And over the years, the United States has played a critical role in helping to provide multilateral answers to global challenges. I always say that the US engagement in the world is one of the strongest forms of support to the United Nations and to our activities. And so I'm very happy to be with all of you here today. And then we need multilateralism and the engagement of the US more than ever, because we live in testing times. From climate change to migration to terrorism to the downsides of globalization, our challenges are more and more global and more integrated. But the responses are more and more fragmented, despite the fact that no single country or organization can address these issues alone. It's a kind of a paradox. As our threats become more global, our capacity to respond becomes more fragmented. And that is why we are facing the enormous difficulties and problems we face in today's world. But of course, saying this is simply not enough, because there is a trust deficit out there in the world. As inequality grows and people in all regions are questioning the effectiveness of international cooperation and of organizations like the UN. And so the biggest challenge for governments and for institutions like ours is to be able to show that we care especially for those people that feel that they are being left behind with the technological progress and globalization in the rust belts of this world. To show that we are able to mobilize solutions that respond to the people's fears and anxieties with answers, with concrete answers for the problems we feel. And we need to demonstrate that the UN is standing up for the people left behind and is connecting to their needs, aspirations, and everyday problems. And I believe the UN is delivering. In the last 2 months alone, we won approval of the work program of the Paris Agreement on climate change in Katowice. Many people thought we would not be able to do it, but it was possible to bring together all countries of the world. We didn't solve the climate change problem, but at least we approved the work plan of the Paris Agreement. We adopted also the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And in our surge of diplomacy for peace, supported by the UN, we are trying and we are starting to succeed in some very important situations of conflict resolution. You have seen that it was possible to broker a ceasefire in Odeida, in Yemen. Let's hope it brings peace and a political agreement. We had recently an important peace agreement on Central African Republic. South Sudan, it was possible to bring together the two leaders and to finally look for the possibility of peace in this country where people have suffered so much. And the US was so strongly engaged for the independence of South Sudan. So I believe the peace in South Sudan has a huge meaning for the population of the United States. But to deliver more, we need to have a UN that is more nimble, more effective, more cost-effective, and more able to overcome the bureaucratic problems and the impediments that always exist in international organizations. And to do all these, we need you. When I look on all of you from dozens of states and universities around the country, I see ambassadors. Ambassadors for understanding, cooperation, and connecting the world of the United Nations with the grassroots. There is no more important issue today than in this context, and I would single out this problem because it's probably the most dramatic that we are facing. We need to together address climate change, the climate crisis. And I know that you agree with me. A recent UN Foundation poll found that climate change is a top priority for young Americans. But climate change is unfortunately running faster than our efforts to slow it. There are good news because there are solutions at hand in the pipeline. There is a technological evolution that makes more and more the green economy the economy of the future. But political will is still lagging behind. And that is why I'm convening a Climate Action Summit in September here in New York to raise ambition. Ambition for mitigation, for adaptation, for financing, for innovation, to really defeat climate change. And today I'm asking for your help in sounding the alarm and in highlighting the solutions. I'm going to tweet a call for #ClimateAction, and I want you to all respond on Twitter, highlighting the steps you are taking to beat the climate change. And I will feature some of our responses on my own Twitter account. Like that, we will be together in this very important endeavor. I firmly believe that we can win this race if we all pull together. And the same argument goes to all our other challenges we face in today's world. You are all committed multilateralists, and I thank you for your service as ambassadors for a better world. I feel inspired by your energy, by your engagement. Keep it up, because we need you more than ever.
Thank you.
I believe that you have some questions.
Yes, and I'm going to help you with those questions. Before the summit, we asked UNA members, and thank you for those inspiring remarks, by the way. Before the summit, we asked UNA members to submit questions. We got a lot of great questions, but we're just selecting a few for you to address today. So the first person, I would like to ask David Blackman of Andover, Massachusetts. David, if you can press your mic and ask their question.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Secretary-General. My name is David Blackman. I'm an international relations student at Suffolk University in Boston. My question for you this... Thank you. Oh, thank you, sir. Much obliged. So my question for you this morning is, in your view, in your opinion, what is the greatest threat to international peace and security that we face in the modern world? And perhaps more importantly, what can we do to address that? What can we do about that?
Well, looking at today, I think the biggest threat comes from the fact that we have a number of conflicts that are becoming more and more interlinked, with fighters that go from one place to another. If you look from Nigeria to Mali, from Mali to Libya, from Libya to Syria, from Syria to Yemen, from Yemen to Afghanistan, you see all these conflicts becoming interlinked and linked to a threat of global terrorism. There was always terrorism, but it was kind of an isolated terrorism, and I felt that the United States was probably the first meaningful target of global terrorism with the 9/11 terrible tragedy that we all recall. But now it became a threat everywhere. I mean, we can have a terrorist attack in any place of the world at any time because it became a global threat. And this combination of conflicts multiplying and interlinking with terrorism is probably today's biggest threat. But I think that we have a serious problem with non-proliferation. Chemical attacks have been multiplying, as we have seen, and there is a clear ban on use of chemicals. And we are now seeing the risks in relation to the nuclear non-proliferation, with some of the pillars of the nuclear disarmament agenda being put into question. So I think there are new threats coming, and we need to be careful. But for the moment, I still think it is this combination of conflicts interlinked and terrorism.
Thank you.
For peace and security, there are other threats. Climate change is a big threat to all of us. The misuse of certain technologies, like information technologies, artificial intelligence, is another potential threat to all of us. But for the moment, I think, for peace and security, the one I mentioned is probably the largest.
Thank you. Our next question...
And of course, what can we do? We are very much engaged in active mediation in many of these conflicts. And we have launched a new office for counterterrorism, and we are creating a network of plans against violent extremism all around the world to try to address the root causes of terrorism in many societies in close cooperation with those societies. And if you look at the mediation efforts that were possible in Yemen, in Libya, with everything we have tried in Syria, I mean, it's the idea to try to disconnect those conflicts and to disconnect them from the terrorist threat.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ruth Miller from Alaska. Ruth, if you can press your mic and have a seat. Press your mic, please.
Where is Alaska?
Yahlidu Ruth Miller shi'iji. Dena enak hanaga shethkun kenash chikanik khali kiriki. Hello, my name is Ruth Miller, and I'm a member of the Kuryong tribe of Dena'ina Athabaskan from Anchorage, Alaska, attending Brown University. Alaska and the Arctic are particularly vulnerable to climate change, where resource extraction has had devastating environmental and humanitarian impacts and is only being accelerated despite international agreement. Indigenous people in the circumpolar north are beyond are suffering today the loss of land, water, and food sources, threatening the preservation of our cultural practices. What new commitments will the United Nations make to culturally reflexive climate justice for the defense of the environment and the indigenous people who depend on it?
Well, indigenous people, and I would say the developing world in general, as in Africa and in other parts of the world, have this paradox. They practically do not contribute to climate change, and sometimes they are the main victims of climate change. And so we need to combine two very aggressive campaigns. One for mitigation, to make sure that countries, especially the G20 countries, the largest countries in the world that correspond to 80% of the emissions, really reduce the emissions, because without reduction of the emissions, we will be facing a catastrophic situation globally. But then we need to have a very strong increase in our investment in support to adaptation in the areas that are more dramatically impacted, and the indigenous peoples are clearly in the front line. And until now, the investment in adaptation is proven to be not enough. If you have seen, and now I'm not talking about only indigenous people, but you have seen the disasters in the Caribbean and even the impact in the United States of some of the storms that take place, you see how much we need to invest in making sure that our communities are more resilient in relation to the impacts of climate change. And the indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable, so we need to have a strong support to their countries in order to be able to provide them with those instruments that allows them to resist better to the climate change impacts.
Unfortunately, Your Excellency, we're out of time.
No excellencies, yeah.
You
know that it's true. I mean, where I work with my colleagues, if anyone says excellency, there is a fine of $1,000. And that's how we are trying to solve the financial problems of the UN. It's true.
So we want to thank you for spending time with members of the United Nations Association of the USA. We appreciate your leadership. We'll continue to support you and continue to support the United Nations. So thank you.
There's still time for a third question. Yeah.
I can't say no to him, so he's asked for a third question. So we're going to have our third question. The final question will come from, let's see, Brian Ramirez from San Antonio. Brian, could you please press your mic?
Yes, thank you.
Where are you?
I'm right here. Right here. Over here. Hi, Mr. Secretary General. I am Brian Ramirez from San Antonio, Texas. My question is, with the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment throughout the Western world, what efforts to protect the human rights and dignity of refugees and immigrants around the world is the UN committed to?
So the question was? You know, I was High Commissioner for Refugees for 10 years. And refugees are those that flee, not because they want to live, not because they want a better future, but because they are forced to flee by a conflict or by oppression, by violations of their basic human rights, by a dictatorship in any part of the world. And so in relation to refugees, there is an international law obligation for countries to protect refugees, and for refugees never to be sent back to their countries of origin. And our appeal to all countries of the world is to keep their borders open to refugees and to grant their protection and to allow them to integrate in their societies, at least during the time in which they are not able to go back to their countries of origin. And I would say that this international protection regime, until a few years ago, was widely respected. We are seeing now, unfortunately, a trend, especially in the richest countries of the world, to be more restrictive in relation to refugees. The good news is that when I look at, for instance, an African continent, I was there just 1 week ago, African countries are keeping their borders open, are receiving sometimes more than 1 million refugees in one country, the case of Uganda, the case of Ethiopia, and really trying to do their best to support them. And we need to mobilize the whole of the international community, first, to share that burden, to also receive refugees, and second, to strongly support those countries that are being so generous, like Jordan, like Ethiopia, like Kenya, and that have received hundreds of thousands, sometimes more than 1 million refugees. Now, migrants is a different story. There is not the right of a person to migrate anytime, anywhere. But we also need to make sure that the human rights of migrants are respected. And we need to understand that we need to combine the interests, legitimate interests of states with the rights of migrants. Now, I come from a country, Portugal, where the fertility index is 1.3. Fortunately, it's not the case of the United States. But which means that the Portuguese society is not sustainable without migration. We will disappear in time if we have no migration. And my mother is 96 years old. And she has a 24/7 support of someone with some, I would say, healthcare capacity, always there to support her. When I visit my mother, I've never seen a Portuguese taking care of her. And Portugal is not a very rich country. It's always migrant workers that are there taking care of my mother. And when one looks at the situation in my continent, in Europe, more and more, even to take care of elderly people, migrants are absolutely essential. Which means migration is a positive thing. What is negative is the fact that so many people are forced to migrate in a way that is irregular, in the hands of smugglers and traffickers that tragically violate their human rights, and we need to combine more opportunities of legal migration, a strong crackdown on smugglers and traffickers, being able to persecute them with the same efficiency that, for instance, we have in relation to drug traffickers, but at the same time, more and more to invest in the countries of origin, to give people the possibility to choose to remain in their countries and build their future with confidence in their own countries. If you combine these three things, I think we'll have a much more humane world in which migration can play a positive role for the people themselves and for the countries, both north and south. Okay? Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Well, I'm Peter Yo. I'm president of the Better World campaign, and that was an exceptional moment to have such a open and exceptional Secretary General who's prepared to listen to what people have to say and share his time with us. So again, thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for an amazing speech and for engaging with us today. It's my pleasure to introduce another great leader, the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs of the United States House of Representatives, Representative Eliot Engel of New York. Now, those of you from the New York City delegation know Eliot Engel well. He has represented parts of the Bronx and Westchester County in Congress since 1989. And just this year, after years of exemplary service on the powerful Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Engel became its chairman in January. Throughout his tenure, Chairman Engel has been a champion for strong and effective American foreign policy. In the past several years alone, he has pushed legislation demanding accountability for war crimes committed in the Syrian civil war. He has spoken out forcefully against ethnic cleansing in conflict zones, including in Kosovo and Myanmar. He has moved forward with legislation to try to force an end to the brutal and ongoing civil war in Yemen, and he's demanded equal protection for LGBTI individuals around the world. Chairman Engel is a member of Congress who delivers time and again, not only for his constituents, but for those of us who advocate for a strong American role in the United Nations. He has fought against U.S. funding cuts to the UN Population Fund, which helps ensure that every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's dreams are fulfilled. He opposed the U.S. withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council, even while expressing his frustration that the Council disproportionately focuses on Israel. Every step of the way, Representative Eliot Engel has been there for a strong American relationship with the United Nations and for an effective U.S. foreign policy. We are deeply grateful for his continued leadership. So please join me in welcoming to the stage a great American leader, Chairman Eliot Engel.
Thank you, Peter. I was hoping that I wouldn't have to speak after the Secretary General because he was so good. So here I am right after the Secretary General. I want to tell you how great it is for me to stand here and look at you, because I remember as a kid growing up in New York, visiting the United Nations with my class several times, sitting down and watching what was going on. The Secretary General then was someone called U Thant. He was from Burma. And we all were taught that the United Nations was really a great hope of the world. And here it is many years later, and I'm standing here before you in this wonderful body. Makes me feel like I've accomplished a little something. When I look at all of you, it really makes me feel great because you're our future. And the fact that you're here and understand how important the United Nations is for all the people in the world, it's very happy. I know that now in this country, in the United States, we're undergoing a whole controversy over immigration. You know, my grandparents came to the United States 110 years ago from Eastern Europe, seeking a better life. It's the same reason people are emigrating all over the world, fleeing persecution, seeking a better life. And I believe that immigration helps the country that the immigrants go to, because who comes and emigrates? Not lazy people, people who are industrious, people who don't know the language, have to learn a new language, people who are willing to better the lot of their family, and in doing so, they better the country that they emigrate to. Now, it's true that you can't just have anybody come and move and have totally open borders, because we all know, unfortunately, in the era of terrorism, we have to be very careful. but it's important that the dignity of every human being, every man and woman, every child is respected. And I think that's what makes me so happy to be here at the United Nations, because that's what it stands for. So I want to say to all of you, welcome to New York City, my hometown. It always makes sense to me that the United Nations chose New York for its headquarters, because the way I think about it, there's no more diverse, exciting international city than New York. So I want to say to all of you, I hope you get to experience some of that while you're here. Just walk the streets and see the people from all walks of life and all parts of the world. Listen to the different languages being spoken, try the food, and listen to those wonderful New York accents. I was 21 before I realized New York had an R in it. You know, in New York, if you live here, you say New York, New York. But I say New York now because I've met some people from outside. I'm sure you'll find New York remarkable, as I do, because I know the sort of curiosity that brings a young person all the way to New York to learn about the UN. It gives me a lot of confidence to see a generation of future leaders like yourselves engaging with global affairs and learning about diplomacy. And it's the kind of curiosity I always had as a kid growing up in the Bronx at a time when this building and the modern international order were relatively new. I still live in the Bronx, and I represent the Bronx in Westchester in the United States Congress, and I have the honor of being the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But I still have that curiosity. Only now I have the honor of serving as chairman, and we're the committee that oversees all our federal agencies dealing with diplomacy and development, and that includes a lot of our countries' work with the United Nations. So I'm glad for the opportunity to share a few words about this organization, what it does well, what it might do not so well, because we're all human, and why it's important. But first, let's take a step back. The United States is the most powerful country in the world in terms of military, economy, culture. Nobody else can project influence around the world the way we can, not by a long shot. So if we wanted, we could throw our weight around. We could say we're going to use our might for our own interests, and if you don't like it, you can pound sand. But the problem with that is, in the long run, it doesn't really work, because a country that isolates itself, that bullies smaller, weaker countries, that doesn't play by the same rules as everybody else, ends up with groups of countries lining up against them. That's the case, too, when a government ignores the rights and prosperity of its own citizens. So even as the most powerful country in the world, we can accomplish a great deal more when we partner with other countries than when we go it alone. Countries that share values or have mutual interests. And by building those relationships, it makes it easier than there is a country that's not playing by the same set of rules. When we decide American leadership and American power are needed to right a wrong, it's easier to share that burden with like-minded governments. That's what multilateralism is all about. And the UN is a forum that makes that sort of work much, much easier. There are UN members that we don't agree with and who don't agree with us. Absolutely. But there are also many countries that do share our views, by and large, and by working together through the United Nations, the UN becomes a critical instrument in addressing some of our greatest global challenges. We see it in UN peacekeeping missions, bringing stability to war-torn regions, in work to expand across to women's health, to the effort of UN AIDS helping prevent the spread of HIV. We see it in areas of dire leadership where the UN helps provide assistance and convenes parties with the goal of ending violence and demanding accountability. A few specific examples. If you've been tracking Congress's work the last few weeks, you know the House just passed legislation that would dial back America's involvement in the war in Yemen. This war is such a heartbreaking catastrophe. 85,000 children have starved to death. 14 million are on the brink of famine. More than 1 million suffer from cholera. And the ongoing military operations are bringing us no closer to a resolution. When it comes to Yemen, we rarely hear any good news. The one bright spot is the fragile ceasefire in place that holds the promise of bringing warring parties to the table. Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, deserves much of the credit for this process and for the progress. At the same time, the UN Resident Coordinator, Lise Grande, has marshaled the world's resources to help meet the crushing humanitarian needs. Every month, the UN's World Food Program feeds more than 7.9 million Yemenis. UNICEF is helping children cope with the unimaginable horrors of living in the midst of conflict. And UNHCR continues to build shelters and run community centers for displaced Yemenis. These efforts alone will not resolve the crisis, but without the United Nations, backed by governments around the world that want to see a political solution to the violence in Yemen, these glimmers of light would surely go dark. Likewise, in Syria, UN humanitarian efforts are bringing relief to more than 2 million Syrians every month, providing temporary shelter, winter protection, and life-saving medicine. Just 3 months ago, UN trucks rolled up to a displacement camp, Rukban, which had been cut off from assistance for nearly a year. These trucks carried vaccines against measles and polio for 10,000 children, cold weather clothing, and basic health and nutrition supplies. UNHCR, the UN office that springs into action to address refugee crises, has acted quickly to process millions of refugees and provide assistance to them and the communities hosting them. And these arms of the UN have performed this heroic work with unspeakable violence going on all around them. The world owes it to the personnel on the ground, and more important, to the people of Syria, who have endured nearly 8 years of unimaginable suffering, to push for an end to the bloodshed. That brings me to another point about the UN. As much good work as the UN does, the organization, like others, has its drawback and flaws. Any member of the Security Council can veto a resolution, and frankly, Russia, a permanent member of the Council and a staunch supporter of the tyrant ruling Syria, Bashar al-Assad, has vetoed every effort in this body since 2015 that would push the crisis in Syria toward a political solution. It's appalling. Every veto is a vote to prolong the crisis, to prolong the war, to take more innocent life. That underscores a challenge that faces the United Nations all the time. I talked earlier about how it takes coalitions and partnerships to stand up to bullies on the world stage. Well, bullies have found ways to manipulate this organization as well. The UN should be a place where moral clarity prevails, but not every government subscribes to that view, and instead, the mechanisms of the UN are exploited by some members to embarrass other members they don't like. The problem is particularly acute when it comes in the way Israel is treated at the UN. Criticism of any government is fair game, certainly including our own and including Israel. But in last year's session of the UN General Assembly, 21 resolutions were passed that singled out Israel compared to just 6 that singled out any other country in the rest of the world. Out of 10 permanent agenda items at the UN, 1 concerns just Israel. Why does anti-Israel bias matter? Because there are so many other hotspots in the world that deserve the UN's attention, and as I've said, would likely benefit from the good work the UN does. The more time the UN spends on Israel, the less time will be spent dealing with human rights violators around the world, such as China, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, North Korea, or Zimbabwe. The citizens suffering in those countries deserve better. I offer this criticism in the hope that American leadership will help to deal with this problem in the years ahead, not as an argument to walk away from this organization, but about strengthening it. I could go on and on about the good work the UN does, down to very specific examples, like the work of the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, that we call CICIG, that has done incredible work to root out corruption in that country. There are scores more examples of success stories like this one. But I hope you all continue to explore the vast, fascinating world of foreign affairs. It becomes clear that very, very seldom are foreign policy issues black and white. All kinds of shades of gray. We have to work with countries we disagree with on certain things. We're far better off working in imperfect multilateral organizations that allow us to build coalitions and find solutions to global changes. And we should use American leadership, rooted in American values, to push for the changes we want to see. I'm so happy to stand here before all of you, before a future generation of public servants and thinkers, the people who will claim the mantle of leadership and carry on the world of building a safer, more prosperous world. I'm grateful for your commitment, and I think that one day you'll be here and have very important roles in keeping world peace. You know, one of the things that I love is when people come to Washington and want to go to the Foreign Affairs Committee and want to intern there and do kinds of things that are so important for the world. You're those kinds of people. No matter what country you come from, whether it's the United States or any other country, we need you. Society needs you. The world needs you. I'm looking at all of you. I see only great things, and I really want to tell you, thank you for coming here. Be involved. Stay involved. Do what you can. One person can make a tremendous difference in the world. And when like-minded, good-minded people band together, there's nothing we can't accomplish if we put our mind to it. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful time this week. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for being with us today and for your inspirational words, and really understanding, explaining how the UN is dealing with humanitarian crises in so many different areas of our world, and how we really can't do it without the broad UN family working to make sure that civilians are protected around the world. So thank you. So this morning we've heard from the top UN leader, António Guterres, and the top congressional leader on American foreign policy, Eliot Engel. I'm now pleased to introduce the top American representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Jonathan Cohen. Now, Ambassador Cohen's job in New York is to represent America's interests at the United Nations, political, security, economic, and we're fortunate to have one of America's top diplomats serving in this role. As a career U.S. Foreign Service officer, he has served our nation in Iraq, France, Cyprus, Italy, Sweden, Austria, and Israel. Ambassador Cohen has guided American foreign policy towards Europe and the Middle East, and has served as a key aide to secretaries of state. Just over the past few weeks here at the United Nations, Ambassador Cohen has spoken out strongly for accountability for human rights violations in the Central African Republic, a free and prosperous Ukraine, a credible and durable solution to the civil war in Yemen, efforts to reduce the number of child soldiers, and the provision of desperately needed humanitarian supplies to displaced Syrian refugees. He's been busy on our behalf and on our nation's behalf. We are incredibly grateful that we have skilled and trained Foreign Service officers who serve Democratic and Republican administrations alike, using their deep knowledge of foreign policy and their diplomatic skills to promote a more peaceful and secure world. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Ambassador Jonathan Cohen.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Peter. Thanks to Chris and Kathy for having me here today. Thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules to come here and explore the important work of the United Nations. Very tough to follow two extremely gifted politicians at the podium. I'm not a politician, I'm a diplomat, so bear with me as I go through my remarks. I'll tell you a little bit about my own background and then focus on the work that we're doing at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. First, I want to thank Congressman Engel for the strong words on anti-Israel bias, with which I wholeheartedly agree, and it's something that the administration is also working very hard on here at the UN. I also want to thank the Secretary-General for his very inspiring remarks. He is a tremendous leader for this institution. As the acting permanent representative of the United States at the UN, it's very encouraging to see so many Americans from so many walks of life engaging in the work of the world's premier multilateral institution. This is where, more than anywhere else, the United States is partnering with other countries every day on virtually every issue on the global agenda. And it's been my great honor to represent the U.S. as a Foreign Service officer over the past 32 years. That means that I came in when Ronald Reagan was president. He signed my first commission, and I've worked for every administration since. And it's been a great honor to represent the people of the United States in postings from Bangkok to Baghdad, and now as our acting permanent representative here at the United Nations. And I'm extremely humbled to lead our missions team of around 115 talented and devoted public servants who strive every day to deliver for the American people here at the UN. To tell you a little bit about myself, I was born in Palo Alto and grew up in Laguna Beach, California, where my journey to this stage began as a 14-year-old participant in Laguna Beach High School Model United Nations. Anyone here from California? Welcome to New York. And anyone here involved in Model United Nations? For those of you who aren't, consider getting involved. It was my greatest dream someday as a student in Model UN to end up in a place like this. I never imagined it would be at this podium in front of an audience like you all, but what a great journey it's been. And I really encourage you all who are pursuing this to keep at it. As Congressman Engel said, spend time with the committees in Washington who work on foreign relations, spend time here in New York, stay involved. It's great that you are. It's really great to see you all here and see the support for America's work in this institution. My journey to American diplomacy isn't just because of Model United Nations. I was also a foreign exchange student in France, and in university studied international politics, as I'm sure many of you do, and Near Eastern studies. I joined the diplomatic corps at the age of 22, right out of graduate school, and spent most of my career representing the U.S. overseas at postings in Europe and the Middle East. Here at the UN, I've been working since June last year, principally as the deputy to Nikki Haley, and then when she left on January 1st, I became the acting permanent representative. And every day, I've been working on a wide range of U.S. foreign policy objectives, as Peter described in the beginning, set forth by the President, including trying to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of the UN, all while promoting international peace and security and defending human rights and human dignity around the world. In our mission to the UN, we strive to ensure that the U.S. remains a leader on the issues that matter most to the American citizens, and that we harness the UN's potential as a force multiplier on issues from peacekeeping to humanitarian assistance to human rights. Let me spend a few minutes talking about our work in the Security Council. As you all know, there are 15 members of the Council, 5 permanent members, 10 non-permanent members who are elected to 2-year terms, and the presidency of the Council rotates every month. It just so happened that in 2018, my first year here at the UN, the U.S. held the presidency during September, which coincides with the annual General Assembly High-Level Week, when all eyes are on the UN as we welcome the leaders from every corner of the world to discuss the most pressing challenges on the international agenda. Having the presidency of the Council provides an opportunity to help frame the global security agenda for that month. So during our month as president, we held the Council's first ever meeting on the situation in Nicaragua in response to a wave of government repression, intimidation, and indiscriminate violence, which left hundreds dead and thousands wounded. It's not easy to add a new subject to the Security Council's agenda. There are Council members who are fundamentally opposed to discussing, for example, human rights issues there. We disagree with that, and in the case of Nicaragua, we knew how important it was for the Security Council to be briefed on the situation on the ground, to understand how protests, initially against pension reform, met government repression, which grew to threaten regional security, and to learn how the Organization of American States was working to find solutions to the serious crisis in our hemisphere. We also held the first ever Security Council briefing focused on how corruption affects global conflicts, both as a driver of conflict and as an obstacle to conflict resolution. Although we often treat corruption as an afterthought when it comes to peace and security, we believe it also is, in cases, a fundamental cause of conflict, and we think the Security Council should address that. As a case study for the nexus between corruption and peace and security, we followed up with a public event on Venezuela. Mind you, this was back in September, 5 months ago. That event highlighted how pervasive corruption in Venezuela had led to the worst man-made humanitarian crisis in the history of this hemisphere, and one of the worst global humanitarian crises in a generation, with millions of Venezuelans forced to flee to neighboring countries. We highlighted the responsibility of Maduro and his cronies for the deepening crisis and the need for the international community to do more. The situation in Venezuela, of course, has come to the forefront in recent weeks. And as you may know, last month we convened the Security Council for a debate on Venezuela with Secretary of State Pompeo in the chair for the United States. And we're continuing to look for ways we can work with and within the UN system to help the plight of the Venezuelan people. My team here remains seized with and working hard on Venezuela every day. In the Security Council, we have regularly raised the topic of human rights violations, even when it's uncomfortable for some of the other members for us to do so, whether in Iran, Burma, North Korea, Syria, or elsewhere. Some Security Council members want to avoid engaging on these topics for a variety of reasons, but we're determined and unflinching in our commitment to shed light on the worst abuses in the world, including in the UN Security Council. In my 8 months at the UN, the Security Council has dealt with situations in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Horn of Africa, Mali, South Sudan, Burundi, Libya, Syria, Iran, Iraq, the West Bank and Gaza, Western Sahara, Lebanon, Yemen, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Cyprus, Ukraine, and on and on and on. In each case, we spoke out strongly for U.S. interests and strove to ensure that they were reflected in Security Council decisions and statements. In our work at the UN, we're also focused intensely on humanitarian crises and humanitarian response. For far too long, the conflict in Syria has caused one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions displaced and hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. We consistently call for accountability for the atrocities committed by the Assad regime, including its use of chemical weapons against its own people. We're also engaged here in a determined effort to make UN peacekeeping missions more effective, efficient, and accountable, with a specific focus on improving peacekeeper performance, including eliminating sexual exploitation and abuse. And on September 21st, when we were president of the Security Council, we oversaw the adoption of a groundbreaking UN resolution establishing a transparent reporting process for performance failures, real accountability measures for those failures, and objective criteria to match the right police and troops with the right peacekeeping roles. UN peacekeepers are doing great and important work around the world, and we're trying to ensure they have the best possible guidance and support. There are about 100,000 UN peacekeepers from dozens of countries in 15 missions around the world, and it's a great privilege to be here to support them as well. In our work at the UN, we're also focusing intensely, as I mentioned, on the humanitarian crisis and response. In all of this, from humanitarian work to peacekeeping to Security Council work to human rights, there are several unifying themes: protecting lives, advancing human dignity, maintaining international peace and security. These are the founding principles of the UN. They're also US values, and they require US leadership and US engagement with the UN to advance them. Because we have an obligation to ensure that the generous contributions of US taxpayers to the UN budget are spent responsibly, as the Secretary-General mentioned, the US is the largest financial contributor to the UN, contributing 22% to the regular budget and 25% to the peacekeeping budget. We are committed to pressing the UN to reduce waste and to avoid mission creep wherever we can. Throughout my career, I've seen many ways the UN can contribute to international peace and security. I've worked with UN representatives, agencies, and on UN issues in just about every foreign service posting I've had, from my first assignment in Thailand as a refugee protection officer, visiting refugee camps along the Lao and Cambodian borders, to coordinating aid programs in the West Bank, to working with the UN peace forces in Cyprus, to my most recent overseas tour in Iraq, where I worked with the UN humanitarian coordinator, Elise Martinez, who, as Congressman Engel mentioned, is now in Yemen, to develop a stabilization program that got over 2 million internally displaced Iraqis home safely at very low cost. In the field, I've seen the UN rise to challenges and exceed expectations, delivering peace, security, and relief with strong US leadership and strong US involvement. So I know what this institution can do when it's at its best and when we support it. The UN could be an even more effective, efficient tool in the service of our and its goals. That's why we're strongly supporting the UN Secretary-General's reform agenda. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So we are committed to working harder to making the UN a more effective, more efficient, more results-oriented body. Our constructive engagement with the United Nations can strengthen UN security and prosperity, while also strengthening that of all other nations. During his address to the UN General Assembly at this stage in September, President Trump noted that the United Nations has unlimited potential and made clear the U.S. is committed to making the UN more effective and accountable. Ultimately, a UN that's more efficient, accountable, results-oriented, and transparent is one that'll better live up to the promise and the vision of its charter, and one that will do more to secure not only U.S. interests, but those of its other member states. From peacekeeping to caring for refugees and others in desperate humanitarian need, to serving as a platform to shine a bright light on human rights abuses and threats to international peace and security, including trying to end wars and keep the peace. It's hard and important work for U.S. interests and for those of the rest of the world. The UN is playing a vital role, and we're committed to making it an even better institution as it fulfills that role. With that, let me once again thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here today and support the important work of the United Nations. It is indeed a great honor to represent all of you here at the UN, and I thank you for your attention.
Ambassador Cohen, thank you for your remarks and for spending time with us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Don Lewis, President for Professional Hygiene for Essity, a global health and hygiene company with a passionate commitment to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. UNA USA and the UN Foundation have partnered with Essity for the past 3 years to catalyze dialogue, new thinking, and creative partnerships for addressing global challenges such as saving lives and advancing human dignity by improving access to hygiene and also connecting the SDGs to new constituencies worldwide, be they in corporate boardrooms or on college campuses. Don, we're delighted you're here to join us today.
Good morning. On behalf of the nearly 50,000 employees at Essity around the globe, it's really a great honor to be a part of this summit. A matter of fact, it's one of my most favorite days of the year. I was actually supposed to be in Stockholm at a board meeting, and I excused myself because it was so important for me to be here with all of you. To be in this great room, the United Nations Assembly Hall, where so much history has taken place. And to be joined by His Excellency, Mr. António Guterres, Congressman Engel, and Ambassador Cohen, and my many friends at the United Nations Foundation. It's truly a great privilege. You know, we may not make history here today, but I feel certain that the conversations that we'll have today can change history towards making the world a safer and more sustainable place to live. Today we talk about the power of shared partnerships and shared responsibilities. At Essity, we are proud to partner with the United Nations Foundation to continue to drive global dialogue around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm sure you know about the United Nations, I'm sure you know about the SDGs. I bet most of you have never heard about Essity before. Essity is one of the world's largest health and hygiene companies. We do business in over 150 countries. We make essential necessities, hence the name Essity, that are used by 1 billion people every day. Things like paper towels and napkins, incontinence and feminine care products, and products used in wound care by doctors and nurses. To bring it down to something that's more familiar, if you've ever been to a Dunkin' Donuts and you've used a napkin, it's our napkins. So give you an idea of the places we're in. Many of the health and hygiene issues our products address deal with topics that are either taken for granted, like hand washing, or go unspoken, like incontinence. We're bringing attention to these issues with our work with the SDGs. By partnering with the United Nations Foundation and other organizations, we're drawing attention to the fact that improving access to health and hygiene can change lives. In some cases, we're doing that one conversation at a time. In fact, sometimes one conversation can truly make a difference. At last year's Global Summit, I had a conversation with many people here, students just like yourselves. And a photo, please. I'll relate one story. There were two people that I spoke to in particular that kept in correspondence with me, Patrick and Jonas. They corresponded with me afterwards on LinkedIn after we had some initial conversation. And they made apparent to me some of the work that they were doing with an organization through their chapter in Kentucky called La Casita. La Casita helps families that have immigrated to the Louisville area and helps them transition into the community. They told me that one of the things that these families really needed were basic products that we take for granted, like paper towels and toilet tissue. We make a lot of both of these, and we do it with 100% recycled fiber. When I heard about this, I said I'd be glad to help. We're the global market leader, and we have a lot of this available. So we got together with our Torque brand and our local manufacturing facility, and we donated a lot of this product to help them. And it was really not our efforts, it was their efforts and persistency and passion reaching out to me and allowing us to help. And by this, they were able to improve the lives of a lot of these people. I wasn't expecting to have that conversation that day, but I'm really glad it took place because it made a long-term connection and allowed me to help. I'm convinced that if we truly listen to each other, that we can really make a difference and we can make the world a better place. Today we listen to each other and other experts on ways to solve many of the world's most pressing challenges. From humanitarian conflict to female empowerment to nuclear proliferation and human rights. And those are just the topics we're going to talk about before lunch. So while these are big issues, I have a lot of confidence in all of you and what we can achieve and what you can achieve. My colleagues and I left last year's summit with an overwhelming sense of optimism about students like you and what you're doing, and the topics that you're focused on at this summit. As a person that's been out of school for a long time, I really want to applaud you being here today for putting your energy towards these big, important issues. And I invite you to look for partners with government, NGOs, and companies like Essity, because together we really can make a difference. I'm proud of all of you for taking the initiative to be here and the work you do every day. It's going to be a truly meaningful day, and we look forward to listening and joining in the conversations with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And now we're about to move into our breakout sessions. We have a lot of great sessions for you today, but before you move, I just want to explain, if you're interested in an issues track anytime today, that will always be in the General Assembly Hall. If you're interested in an action track, that will always be in conference room number 4. If you need an Asl interpreter, please come see me. And if at any time of the day you have a trouble hearing, you have those earphones in front of you that you can put on. They do work. So, and one last thing, if you have any questions, we have staff and volunteers wearing an Ask Me button, so please reach out to them if you have any questions. So before you move, just want to tell you where the next 2 sessions are. If you're interested in the conflict resolution and humanitarian response on Yemen, you'll stay here. And if you're interested in the hashtag Leave No Girl Behind, changing the world to empower girls, you'll go to conference room 4. So if you're going to conference room 4, you can exit out on the sides and you'll go down 1 level and into conference room 4. So I hope you have an enjoyable day and I look forward to seeing you later on. The next session will begin in 2 minutes, so if everyone can take their seats, please. If everyone can take their seats, please. Once again, we'll be starting in 2 minutes. Thank you. Okay, if everyone can get seated, we're starting right now. And if I can have the panel for the conflict resolution and humanitarian response come to the stage, please. And I'll turn it over to our moderator. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, the Chief Communications Officer for the United Nations Foundation. It's so great to see so many of you here. Before we start, who is in the UN for the first time today? Wow, okay. And so that means you're also in this room for the first time. I get really excited when I come in this room. How do you feel to be here? I'm glad to hear it. This is a very, very special chamber. Some really important discussions take place in this chamber, and I'm delighted that we will be able to have three incredible people today to take part in a really important discussion. This panel this morning is thinking about the awful conflict in Yemen, as Chairman Engel just a few minutes ago described, a heartbreaking catastrophe. And he also mentioned, briefly, the enormous cross-agency response from within the UN. He said, without the UN, backed by governments around the world, the glimmers of light that we see in this awful conflict would surely go dark. So today I want you to leave here understanding more about what the UN is doing to address the crisis in Yemen, and also what we as a global community need to do even more to bring this to an end. The UN's played many, many roles, from providing humanitarian assistance and investigating human rights abuses to advancing delicate diplomatic negotiations, and they resulted in a major breakthrough in December 2018 when the UN Security Council passed its first comprehensive resolution on the conflict in 3 years, endorsing a limited ceasefire that was reached by parties with the UN's backing. It also called for the deployment of a monitoring mission on the ground. So this panel is going to explore the dimensions of that recent Yemen peace agreement, as well as the next steps for the UN and the international community. I'll introduce my speakers in 1 second, but a very brief bit of housekeeping about how this will work. I'm going to ask each panelist one quick question to whet our appetites, and then we'll have a moderated panel discussion, and speakers, don't wait to be asked, please jump in. I know none of you are shy. And then we will save some time, we'll aim to save some time at least, for questions from you all at the end, and we have a couple of people going around to help us do that. And we'll be out of here by 11:05, I think, is our end time, so it gives you plenty of time to get to the next session. Let me introduce our panel. Her Excellency Ambassador Karen Pierce became the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York in March 2018, so almost 1 year in the role, after a long and distinguished career in the UK Foreign Service, which included high-level roles overseeing the UK's involvement and relationship with Afghanistan. She was indeed the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan from 2015 to 2016. And she's also spent much time at the UN's headquarters in Geneva as ambassador and permanent representative of the UK mission to the UN there, the World Trade Organization, and other international organizations. Darko Muchibub is Deputy Director of the Middle East and West Asia Division in the United Nations Department of Political Affairs. Peacebuilding, isn't it? And peacebuilding, apologies. He also brings extensive experience of conflict zones, having worked for the UN in both in and on Iraq, including being based in Baghdad for almost 3 years. Louis Charbonneau is the United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining HRW, he was a journalist for more than 2 decades, most recently the UN Bureau Chief for Reuters. In his role as a journalist, he won several awards, particularly for his reporting on efforts to curb the spread of nuclear weapons. Panel, thank you so much for your time this morning. We look forward to your comments. Ambassador Pierce, let's start with you, if I may. Leadership from the UK in the UN Security Council was critical to getting this resolution passed in December. The resolution created a framework for implementing a limited ceasefire. Another resolution established a new political mission to help implement and monitor the accord that was passed by the Security Council. Tell us now, so where are we exactly now in terms of the resolutions, the process, and how is the Security Council's consensus holding up on Yemen?
Well, thank you very much indeed, and good morning, everybody. Congratulations to UNAUS for having such a great turnout, and welcome to all those people who are new to the UN. I think it's quite an inspiring moment when you come into the General Assembly chamber for the first time. I remember I was totally overawed by it. So hopefully this will be the start of some great careers for those of you who are new. Thanks for the question on Yemen. I think the important thing to say is that we are in a much better place on Yemen than, say, 6 months ago. Although the humanitarian situation is still very precarious, the fact that the UN have been able to get the parties to agree to a ceasefire and start the steps towards redeployment of their frontline forces and also tentative steps towards a political settlement is a huge achievement for the UN. And although there's a huge amount more to do, we shouldn't underestimate what's been achieved so far, given that the conflict in Yemen has been going on for such a long time and puts some 22 million people at risk. So the scale of the challenge is huge. But I think the second thing to say, and the Security Council is very aware of this. The second thing to say is that the situation remains fragile. We can't take anything for granted, and every day that goes by that the ceasefire holds is obviously a good day and gives us hope that we can eventually move the conflict onto a political situation, but we can't be complacent. And the UN people on the ground, especially the Special Envoy, need every possible bit of backing and support from the Security Council. You asked about consensus. So far, the Security Council consensus and unity has held up very well, better perhaps than we might have expected, given tensions on other issues. I think all members of the Security Council realize what is at stake in Yemen, what's at stake for the people of Yemen, what's at stake for regional stability, and that is helpful. I think everybody also wants the UN to have a success. So there's a lot of goodwill for everybody on the Council to go the extra mile, support the Special Envoy. As you mentioned, so far there have been 2 Security Council resolutions. These are resolutions that endorse things that have already taken place. So fundamentally, the agreement at Stockholm on the ceasefire and next steps, and then fundamentally the agreement on the redeployment of forces that General Lowersgaard managed to broker. Security Council resolutions that endorse real-world steps are often easier to achieve than Security Council resolutions that demand the parties do something without real-world progress. But we take these issues to the Security Council to codify and reinforce the agreements and to press the parties to really make a move on implementation. We also use the resolutions because we're very concerned about the humanitarian situation, and we want to support the UN's efforts there to get food and medicine and other supplies in.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think one thing that I noticed from your response there is the ability that you did to kind of shine a little light for people here on the process of diplomacy. It's slow, there are very many steps you have to take, it's very, very detailed, but you have to relate it to the situation on the ground all the time. So with that in mind, Darko Mochibob from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, what do you think has been the role of the UN in actually getting to this position with the ceasefire agreement, with the monitoring mission, and shoring up the consensus? And do you think there are any lessons learned yet, or is it still too early for that?
Thank you very much, and warm welcome to the United Nations, especially for the ones who are here for the first time. The United Nations has been involved in the Yemen crisis from the very start. Yemen was one of the countries affected by the developments of the so-called Arab Spring. I prefer the Arab uprisings. And the UN got involved in trying to prevent the country sliding into conflict there. The long-term president at the time was willing to relinquish some powers, and the UN, together with the key members of the Security Council and the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, managed to broker a deal which at that time looked like a way out to avoid the conflict and resolve issues that have led to the Arab uprising, the developments there. Unfortunately, after a while, the deal collapsed because the parties started avoiding deadlines, putting additional not negotiated conditions, and eventually the deal collapsed. Then the so-called Houthi movement, the Ansar Allah, made a military move and took over with its allies the capital and the large swaths of the territory, marginalizing the legitimate government based on the National Dialogue Agreement at the time. That in turn led to increased fighting, and at one point the military intervention on the side of the government of Yemen by the coalition led by Saudi Arabia, with the stated goal of reinstating the legitimate government of Yemen. That then caused the serious humanitarian disaster. Yemen has been, even before the start of the crisis, the poorest country in the Arab Peninsula, and there was not much resilience in the population. So very quickly, the breakdown of the services, the imports, the financial systems led to the serious humanitarian crisis. With that, there was also a mounting civilian toll as a result of the conflict. So the UN has tried first to stop the conflict through a number of ceasefire attempts, and then, to mitigate the humanitarian and socioeconomic consequences of the conflict. The latest opening to do something about it was towards the end of last year. Number of things contributed to this. The coalition made some territorial gains, which put additional pressure on the Houthi movement. There was growing outcry internationally over the humanitarian suffering and the civilian casualties. I would also mention that to some extent a fallout of the murder of Khashoggi in the Istanbul played a role, which all allowed the UN and other the stakeholders interested in progressing with the peace to push for an agreement. And it did happen in a quite dramatic fashion, almost unexpectedly, in Stockholm, under the leadership of UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. Even the Secretary-General traveled to Stockholm to give the final push to the agreement when the two sides, the government of Yemen and the Ansar Allah Houthi movement, agreed on the several agreements, including the one on the Port Hodeidah, the main port for import of foods, both humanitarian and commercial foods. There was an agreement on, to start discussions on prisoner exchanges, and there was also agreement on the city of Taiz, which is controlled by the pro-government forces but besieged by the Houthis. The first order of business was the implementation of Hodeidah Agreement because of its criticality for the humanitarian assistance. Madam Ambassador already mentioned some of the figures. 80% of the Yemen population is in need of some sort of assistance. It has been, it remains the largest man-made humanitarian emergency in the world. So that is the first order of business. Inevitably, when you have diplomatic negotiations, there's pressure to keep the momentum and conclude them quickly. So some things are left out and they're left for later, kicked down the road, which then, in turn complicates the implementation. So we're making headway, and we can talk later about the implementation. The window is there, but the danger is that it may eventually close unless we succeed in implementing the agreements fully.
I want to come back to that point later on, actually, in the discussion when we talk about, okay, what has to happen next to make sure that everything is buttoned up. Louis Charbonneau, how can we ensure that human rights stays at the center of the consensus and the ceasefire agreement and anything else that diplomatic offices are working on right now?
Thanks. It's great to be here, and congratulations to all of you for coming and filling the room like this. And we're so glad that you care about this very important and very sad subject. And this is a great question for Human Rights Watch. This is what we do. We monitor human rights abuses. We report on them. We ask for changes. We call for accountability. And so some of the specific things that we're interested here in Yemen is, first of all, first order of business, ensure humanitarian access. Also for the port of Hodeidah that Darko was speaking about, aid is still blocked. Both sides are doing it. The Saudi-led coalition is obstructing humanitarian aid for no reason at all, including by subjecting humanitarian cargoes to various bureaucratic obstacles. The Houthi side is doing it as well. All parties should facilitate humanitarian aid. There's no reason not to. There was part of the deal were prisoner exchanges. They haven't taken place so far. We're very worried that this is one of the things that could cause the deal to unravel if it doesn't happen. Accountability is also important. Sometimes people say, oh, you'll ruin the peace discussions if we focus too much on accountability. We have a saying that there's no peace without justice, and too often this proves to be the case. We need to make sure that both sides, which have committed war crimes, many of them, are held accountable. The Saudi-led coalition has conducted airstrikes for years that have accounted for the largest number of civilian deaths, but the Houthi side has also committed a number of war crimes, including they're using landmines, something we've been looking at recently, and preventing aid from getting through, all sorts of other things. Finally, no one should be selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and should be very careful about giving weapons to other members of the Saudi-led coalition because they may end up being complicit in war crimes. One of the things that we were very happy about with Ambassador Pierce in the United Kingdom was they tried to get the word accountability into the resolution in December. Unfortunately, other council members didn't want that word to be in there. But this is the kind of human rights leadership we like to see, and it would be great if the United Kingdom could show this leadership and join those that aren't selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. This would send a strong signal. And very last point, we like to hear from Yemeni Voices. It's not easy to get them into the various form, but it's always worth it when we can hear what they're experiencing on the ground.
Okay, Louis Charbonneau, thank you very much. Do you want to pick up on that, Ambassador, at all, or not at all?
I'm happy to pick it up in discussion, or I can come back.
Let's open it up now, actually,
okay.
Yeah.
So I think Lewis is absolutely right about accountability. We did want a much stronger, indeed any, reference to accountability in the Security Council resolution. This is one of the risks of negotiating resolutions to deadlines. In the end, you don't have infinite time to complete a negotiation, and the imperative was to get the Stockholm agreements endorsed by the Security Council as fast as possible. So when you put yourself under that time pressure, you will end up with trade-offs, unfortunately. But we don't forget about accountability in Yemen. We would have a different assessment, I think, than Lewis has just given of how exactly that should play out. But the point about the Security Council resolution is that this is an issue we'll want to come back to.
And then, presumably, then, it's important to get something in place upon which to build.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, that is precisely the idea. The set of the Stockholm agreements is just a smaller subset of what is needed to achieve a comprehensive political solution for Yemen. But the parties were very clear, in particular the government of Yemen, that unless the 3 Stockholm agreements are implemented fully, there will be no next stage, to discuss a broader peace accord.
Okay, so let's think about the next stage. What now needs to happen to turn where we're at now into something that can last? Who wants to go? Ambassador, would you like to take that again?
Well, why doesn't DARCO? Because fundamentally it's a UN-led negotiation.
Okay, as I mentioned, the first order of business is Hodeidah, that port and a couple of smaller ports nearby, and the province of Hodeidah, because of the humanitarian routes leading to the population in need. The United Nations is chairing something called RCC, the Redeployment Coordination Committee, which has the task to bring the 2 parties together on the ground and have them agree on the schedule for removing their forces from the port of Hodeidah. It is chaired by the 1-star Danish general currently, the General Olesgaard, who is on the ground in Hodeidah. And he has managed a few days ago, last weekend, to negotiate the first phase of the redeployment of forces. But we're talking about the parties that have been at each other's throats for several years. There were a lot of atrocities, killings, and there's a deep lack of trust there. They're even, they're suspicious of each other, to meet in the same location, whether the location is one side or another. So the general would have to physically go and bring one side delegation to the other to provide the assurances that they will be safe. But little by little, they have agreed on the first phase. That would allow the parties to separate from the confrontation line and move certain distance initially, which will reduce the risk of small arms fire incidents. And the second phase, hopefully, would lead to the redeployment of the artillery pieces from Hodeidah to safe distances, so neither side can use those against the other. On the first phase, the elements and the stages of the phase have been agreed. The devil, as usual, is in the detail. The Houthis are ready to implement immediately. The coalition, or rather the government of Yemen, is putting a condition that they want to vet the members of the local security force that will stay when the military forces separate, that will stay in the city of Hodeidah. That, of course, is a danger to the process. We are at the risk of losing the momentum because such vetting process, even under best circumstances, would take time. But in the conditions of Yemen, it can take months easily, and then it would be too late because ceasefire is generally holding, but there are daily incidents, and the frustration is growing on both sides.
Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe looking forward to what we would like to see. First of all, full implementation of the Hodeidah Agreement, but we would like to see this expanded for the entire country, as everyone, I think, sitting here would also like. We also feel that it's very important for the Security Council to continue keeping the pressure on all of the parties. And one of the things that we would like to see is the sanctions regime used to the fullest. There are sanctions on one side, on the Houthi side, but we'd like to see the Council at least consider using the sanctions tool against senior members of the Saudi-led coalition, those who are responsible for some of the crimes that we've been talking about, and then continue to support the UN efforts that have been mandated by the Human Rights Council in Geneva to this group of eminent experts that has been gathering facts and evidence of various abuses and human rights violations so that we have a record of it and can use it for the accountability that we all want to see.
This is really fascinating to hear you bring all your different perspectives to the issue at hand. There's a civil society perspective, there's the UN's perspective, and perhaps the greatest power the UN brings is its convening power and its neutrality. And then there's the perspective of important bilateral relationships between governments. So how do you all kind of like bring your individual kind of expertise there to bear, to actually bear fruit on this? Ambassador.
Thanks very much. Actually, I just wanted to respond to Lewis's last point, if I may, because there's an important distinction between the conflict in Yemen and some of the other conflicts where there are sanctions applying to governments. The Security Council passed a resolution on Yemen a few years ago that records that the reason there is a conflict in Yemen is because of an insurgency by Ansar Allah, by the Houthis. That is still a fundamental fact, even as the UN works to broker an agreement and a resolution. And that very first resolution called on the Houthis to do things they have not done. In contrast, the Saudi-led coalition, while there have undoubtedly been mistakes in their targeting, there isn't actually an international finding of war crimes Instead, the Saudi coalition has an internal accountability mechanism that investigates where international humanitarian law principles have not been followed. So while from Lewis's point of view, I understand why he wants sanctions on people he believes have violated human rights, but actually those two things are not the same thing. There isn't an international finding against which to put sanctions on the coalition. And as the British government, we work closely to help the Saudi targeters and others understand what international humanitarian law means in practice.
This was not by design, but I'm seated in the middle, between the member state, the representative, and the civil society as the representative of UN system, the secretariat. So I'm symbolically squeezed in the middle. But the fact is that but I'm not uncomfortable. The fact is the UN system, secretariat, and otherwise, delivers best when there is a general consensus on the side of member states, Security Council, and broader, and other stakeholders and civil society being the very important one. And what gives me some hope that Yemen may actually progress in the right direction is there is generally the consensus, despite the advocacy and some differences as well. On Yemen, currently that does exist. So the second thing I want to say about accountability and human rights, for the UN system, our previous Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon, launched the initiative called the Human Rights Upfront, and it still very much permeates through all our activities there. So even if we want to, we are reminded, of the need, in all our activities to take into account the basic rights and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. So it's very much there, but then there's a tactical approach, in diplomacy to this. I will mention another example. I come from Bosnia-Herzegovina, the country that went through a bloody civil war in the early 90s. And eventually it ended through a Dayton peace agreement signed here in Dayton, Ohio. And the parties brought to the table, many of the delegations had people clearly responsible for war crimes. But it was very difficult, to put in the agreement accountability, because you would ask the people who will be subject to prosecution to agree that they will be subject to prosecution. So tactically, the peace agreement was negotiated by late Richard Holbrooke of the U.S. So he navigated this carefully, apparently at some point being ambiguous about the assurances to some of the lead potential war criminals that, if they step down, then it may not be prosecuted, but never putting in writing, so allowing the agreement to move forward. But most of them have ended up in the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in The Hague, and they got what they deserved. So there's also the time, the scale for these things, when is the right thing to put certain things forward.
Okay. Bearing in mind that this is the Global Engagement Summit, what I want panelists for you to do now is think about, before we open it up to questions, is what is the role for people here? For not just in this room, people watching, people, ordinary citizens around the world and across the US, in helping to end this conflict. What would you encourage them to do? Louis Charbonneau, why don't we start that with you?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to think about what people in this country might want to do that would really help. At the moment, the U.S. Congress is looking for ways to pressure the Trump administration to end its unequivocal support for Saudi Arabia, for what's going on in Yemen, to take a much more cautious approach. I was very pleased that Darko brought up the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist, back in October. And I would remind people that Just recently, the preliminary findings of the UN Special Rapporteur, who's investigating that murder, said that all evidence points to the involvement of Saudi state officials and a deliberate state decision. So this is the country that's leading the coalition in Yemen, and these are the kinds of abuses that we want everyone to remember. So we would like people to remind Congress, to tell the Trump administration, keep this in mind. Is this the kind of government that you want to do business with? And is business as usual possible? We say no.
Okay, that's the Thank you. That's the civil society view, the advocacy organization view. Let's get the view of the UN, the international view. What can people here do to help?
Well, I would say, stay interested, engage, and speak up, at various levels, in particular about the humanitarian suffering of the population. Because of the geography of Yemen and the security situation, international media were not as present in Yemen as they were, let's say, during the Iraq conflict or even in Syria. So we have not seen much of that, so it's easy to forget, if you don't see daily on the screens. That has recently changed with BBC and others, making some very compelling pieces about showing the toll that the civilians are taking. So stay engaged, try to understand and speak up. The advocacy is important in this country and other countries that are stakeholders for that. I did mention the Khashoggi murder, but I mentioned that as one factor. It was not the sole factor. That alone would have not led to the success in Stockholm. There are a number of other things, including the fatigue of the fighters, the reaching the military stalemate, and so on. So there are other factors there as well. I will mention another thing, the use of various sanctions and pressures, because the progress in implementing Hudaydah agreement is rather slow because of all sorts of things, security, lack of trust, bureaucracies, and so on. There's a growing frustration. So there's a pressure in some quarters for the U.S. to put the Ansar Allah on the list of terrorist organizations. And, we're not naive, they're not a bunch of Boy Scouts, as such, but again, it's a matter of timing, and how you use strategically such kind of stick, doing it right now in the middle of the efforts to implement the Hudaydah agreement would be disastrous to the UN effort there. So, and only yesterday the Secretary-General spoke to Secretary of State Pompeo, and Yemen, apart from Venezuela, were the topics of this conversation. So these are the things, if you follow the news, and if you have a chance to influence your representatives, the civil society at large, is very helpful to the UN process. But the timing is very critical here.
I think the most important thing you can do, whether it's on Yemen or any other issue that you feel strongly about, is engage and get involved. And, it doesn't really matter if you would be writing to your senator and congressman or congresswoman with a different view from the view I have. The most important thing is that civil society, ordinary people, let political leaders know that they are watching international affairs and that they care about the outcome. And I don't know how many people in the room might have read a book by Stephen Schlesinger. It's about the founding of the United Nations back in 1945. And he has a fantastic description of how the American government encouraged different states to set up the forerunners of political action committees to cheerlead for the UN and for involvement in international affairs. So I think whatever your point of view, getting involved is really important. And then I think the second thing, as Darko said, is very much the humanitarian appeal. Yemen is unusual because so many supplies need to come in through the ports by sea. And these are not just humanitarian supplies, commercial supplies of food and medicine and other essentials need to come through those ports. And it's expensive and it's very difficult. So anything you can do or your local associations can do to help fundraise for the Yemen Appeal, there'll be a big conference later in spring, a pledging conference. Anything that can be done to help raise money for that appeal is helpful.
Okay, panelists, thank you so much. Okay, let's get some questions from members of the audience. Lots of hands go up. We have a few people wandering around who have big placards, I think. Where are you guys? There you go. Okay, so I'm going to get you to go over to some of the people asking questions. Let's go over to this section over here. Oh, you got one over there already, actually. Yeah, I can see you. Okay. So, yeah, young lady in red, press your button and then you can ask your question. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, and then I encourage you to make it a short statement with a question mark at the end of it.
Yes, can I speak? Hi, my name is Imelda Harley and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. It's my first time here and I'm very excited to be part of this. It's really sad when we have these humanitarian conflicts in countries like Yemen. And my question is, what else can we do, you know, as a citizens of other countries to contribute to end this conflict, besides just being part of the UN, USA? I mean, I think the United Nations is doing a great job, but we need to do more to end this conflict.
Well, yeah. I think you may have already answered that point. Let's get a couple of other questions, and maybe we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll just throw them all open to the panel as well. Okay, yes, somebody in the second row here. You pick one. Yeah, young lady in the middle there with the grey on. Yeah, next to you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I thought this was a very interesting panel, and I like that there are 3 different views presented here. I understand why there is a kind of distinction between the civil society point of view and the UN point of view. And I understand why UN cannot always call out all the wrongdoings, at least, you know, DPPA can't. But I want to know what's the UN's point of continuing to maintain its impartial stance when the parties themselves do not respect UN-brokered peace agreements and ceasefires? How many mistakes are they allowed, and how many times are they allowed to kind of, thank you.
Let's get one more question, then we'll throw it up to, yeah, just go back. Yeah, turn to your left now. That gentleman. Yep. Just, you can stay seated and press your button.
Hello. All right, hi, my name is Arif bin Johan Aliman. I come from Northeastern University in Boston. So I wanted to touch on a point that was brought up that could be viewed as somewhat of an economic and security paradox for the United Kingdom. So I would like to recognize the initiatives that the United Kingdom and you, Madam Ambassador, has brought forward. However, and I don't want to stray away from this, but I wanted to inquire about the report that there was about £5 billion worth of arms that was traded to Riyadh since 2015. Is the United Kingdom complicit in contributing to the bloodshed in Yemen? And on a larger note, how would you convince us in the room that the flood of arms into the MENA region does indeed contribute to peace?
Question seems to be just for Her Excellency the Ambassador, so let's get one more question that's maybe more centrally about the issue. Let's go to this side over here. Maybe let's run down here. Run. Thank you. Little faster. Yeah, how about that? Go for it. Great, thank you.
Yes, my name is Elise Martinez, and I'm from Virginia. And my question, when you were talking about the Saudis' refusal to allow humanitarian aid, and my question, I guess, is when the Saudis allow the humanitarian aid to go into Yemen, how will you guarantee, or how do you guarantee, that the people get the aid and the aid does not go to the insurgents?
Okay, great. Some really good questions there. Thank you very much, everyone in the room. Panelists, Darko, let's maybe start with you. There's a couple of questions that really touched on the role of the UN, one more kind of granular about making sure that aid gets to people, one more a little bit meta, what's the point of the UN?
About the impartiality, the UN needs to stay impartial. That does not equate to being neutral, so these are two different things. We do have obligation to speak up about violations whether of the Charter, the international humanitarian law, or specific agreements, and we do so. As I said, tactically, sometimes we let one part of the UN system to be more vocal, play the bad cop, to allow the other, to play good cop and continue progressing the agreements. But as the UN system, we do speak up and we do speak often, without regard, whether this side or that side may get upset. Because, as you mentioned, one of the UN's advantages is the convening power, and we can only retain this if we remain impartial, not neutral. On the humanitarian assistance, I wouldn't say that the Saudi or Saudi coalition is preventing humanitarian assistance. It's also the fact that the members of the coalition, Saudi and UAE in particular, are the largest donors to the humanitarian response. Some may think that's cynical. You have a pyromaniac trying to extinguish the fire. Whatever you think, the fact is they have contributed billions, and the billions were transformed into a humanitarian, essential humanitarian assistance that in many cases have reached people. There are difficulties in distributing an arrival of humanitarian assistance stemming from the conflict itself. There's a panoply of the militias, the warlords everywhere. They maintain checkpoints. They try to collect tolls, and in some cases they divert the humanitarian assistance. So there are also difficulties for the UN to send the monitors to assure that in every corner of the country in conflict, so we will lose a percentage of this to the wrong purposes. It will end up being sold in the black market and so on. And we are constantly, also pressured by donors, improving mechanisms to ensure that that reaches. But I have to make a point that humanitarian assistance, as said, it's the largest humanitarian emergency in the world. We will require 4.4 billion just for the essentials in this year alone. So and the funds are already, despite the generous contributions, funds are already running out. But despite the size of it, it's still a Band-Aid, in a situation, and it's not sustainable for a long time. So political solution to this is essential.
Yes, thanks. Some very good questions here. And on the one about how many mistakes are allowed, I mean, this is an excellent question, and it made me recall something that I think Darko and Ambassador Pierce will probably remember during the war in Bosnia, when the United States finally acknowledged that there were, quote, unquote, acts of genocide committed in Bosnia. And then a journalist, former colleague of mine, asked the question, how many acts of genocide does it take to make a genocide, right? So how many mistakes do we have before we get a disaster? So this is always something that, and I don't have an easy answer for this, but we need to keep our eyes on all of these mistakes. It's true that it isn't that no aid is getting in, and both the Houthi side and the Saudi coalition are responsible for what we're pointing out are obstructions. There is some aid that gets prevented from getting in, but it's more a question of obstructions, of blocking, and problems that are created. Not enough aid is getting in. That's the main point. Yeah.
Okay, Ambassador.
Thanks very much. I'd like to also address the war crimes point before going on to the arms sales, if that's all right. Lewis and I have known each other a very long time, but we come at this issue from slightly different perspectives, because one of us is in government and one of us is an advocate. And the fundamental answer to the question to Darko about when do you dial up and when do you go quiet? In principle, you don't go quiet. In principle, these things are terrible. They should be called out. It's the Security Council's job to set up international justice mechanisms. At the moment, we struggle with that as a whole, not just on Yemen, because 2 countries in particular, 2 permanent 5 members, don't want us to set up those mechanisms. But when you use them and when you decide, are you better off pursuing a political process and trying to deal with justice later, or are you better to do the 2 in parallel? Actually, there's no perfect answer. You do the best you can to get the result you want at the point at which you have to make a decision. I'll also give you an example from Bosnia, if I may, which I used to work on. The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia was actually set up before Srebrenica. It makes the Srebrenica crime even more horrendous when you think that there was an international tribunal. But that tribunal had indicted various generals, and we had the opportunity to detain, through NATO forces, one of those generals who had a very serious indictment. But it came just at a critical moment in the peace process. And I was a middle-ranking diplomat, so I put up a submission to our ministers saying we should arrest him anyway because there's no impunity for war crimes. My boss said, hang on a minute. We want the peace process to succeed because without the peace process, there'll be more war crimes in Bosnia. In the end, our minister agreed with my boss, and we were all very cross. But a few months later, when that peace process had run into the sand, that particular strand, the foreign minister wrote to me to apologize for not going with my and my team's judgment. The point I'm making is there isn't a right or wrong answer. You make the best decision you can at the point at which you have to make it, and if you get it wrong, you learn. And that, unfortunately, is untidy, but it's probably the best answer I can give you. Turning to the arms sales point, the British government has really strict criteria for selling arms to any country, but including Saudi Arabia. And it needs to, I've seen your note, thanks a lot. It needs to be signed off in a very strict way. It needs to be signed off by ministers. It depends on certain criteria that are subject to public scrutiny. But we don't believe that we have in any way contributed to the fighting in Yemen. But I think the important thing to say is that it is not illegitimate that the Yemeni government asked the coalition to help it. When you go back to the first UN resolution, they are describing an insurgency that the coalition went to help the legitimate government of Yemen deal with. I think it's important to get that straight because a lot of other conflicts the Security Council deals with have very different origins. Sorry to go on.
Okay, no, not at all. Thank you for making that point. Panel, I think you can see we have an incredibly engaged audience here. It is the Global Engagement Summit. So audience, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to invite you now to thank our expert panelists for their brilliant remarks this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh and panelists, for that great discussion. Just to let everyone know, the next session coming up in this room will be the issues track Nuclear Proliferation, Hot Topics, and Cold Tensions. And in Conference Room 4, the next session will be Shared Action for Human Rights, the UN and Partners on the Ground, and it will start within 15 minutes. Thank you. everyone. The session will start in 3 minutes. Please take your seats. The session will start in 3 minutes. Once again, if everyone can start taking their seats, the session will be starting in a couple minutes. Once again, if everyone can take their seats. I know, that's... So you guys moving up just a little bit with your chairs? You're welcome. Okay, I think we're ready to begin. The next session, good afternoon or good late morning, everyone. The next session is nuclear proliferation, hot topics and cold tensions. And I'd like to turn over to the moderator, Ankit Panda. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for coming out this morning to talk about some of the most important threats to international peace and security facing our world here today. I'm Ankit Panda. I'm a senior editor at The Diplomat, a magazine focusing on the Asia-Pacific, where I focus primarily on security and defense issues. I'm also an adjunct senior fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. I'm delighted to be joined here today by an expert panel of three really incredible people who will be able to give us a survey of many of these issues relating to nuclear non-proliferation that remain, unfortunately, all too relevant today. Immediately to my left, we have Ambassador Kholisa Mabongo, who is the representative of the IAEA Director General to the United Nations and Director of the IAEA's New York office. Immediately to his left, we have Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And to her left, we have Carlos Rodriguez Cruz y Celis, a member of the United Nations CTBTO Youth Group. Nuclear weapons remain all too relevant today. In fact, in many ways, we're on the cusp of what some scholars might call the third nuclear age. The first nuclear age, of course, during the Cold War was defined by the contours of superpower conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. We saw nuclear arsenals balloon up into the tens of thousands. The second nuclear age began after the end of the Cold War with a shift towards cooperative threat reduction, managing the collapse of the Soviet Union, sustaining arms control agreements, managing non-proliferation challenges around the world. In 1998, we saw India and Pakistan break out as nuclear weapon states. We attempted to prevent the breakout of North Korea, which remains unfortunately an issue that is all too relevant today. Of course, next week we're looking forward to a summit between President Donald Trump of the United States and Kim Jong-un of North Korea in Hanoi, Vietnam. And the third nuclear age might be defined by new developments in technology, advances in missile defense, unfortunately the removal of certain arms control agreements and potentially the growth of arsenals that had been shrinking for decades. So to discuss some of these issues and to take a broader survey of the global non-proliferation landscape, I'm really delighted to be joined by our three speakers today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn first to Ambassador Mabongo. Ambassador, let's start by looking at this global landscape that I just described. Tell us a bit about what the international community is doing to combat nuclear non-proliferation and what role specifically the IAEA plays today.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting us to participate in this discussion. In terms of non-proliferation, as you are aware, there is quite a number of treaties and norms that states have come together around to ensure that there is no proliferation or spread of weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps the preeminent treaty on this is the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which is referred to normally as the NPT. So under the NPT, basically the non-nuclear weapon states undertook not to acquire nuclear weapons or spread them and other nuclear explosive devices. And again, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, states members of the non-nuclear weapon states have signed safeguards agreements with the IAEA. So the IAEA is an independent, impartial technical organization, and we play a role for the past 6 decades. We've been making our own contribution to stop the proliferation, to contribute to non-proliferation, essentially. And I'll just mention 3 aspects of the work of the IAEA in this regard. The first one, I've already mentioned, is the safeguards agreements that states sign with the IAEA. So what this means basically is that states give us declarations, and we also source information through other sources about what nuclear material they possess and what nuclear material is in their territories. And based on this, we then apply safeguards, which are technical measures to ensure that we can account properly and factually and in an impartial way for all this nuclear material to make sure that it is not diverted for use in nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. So safeguards are technical measures, basically. So we have inspectors who travel around the world visiting different countries to physically inspect nuclear facilities and nuclear material and actually account for it to make sure that it is not diverted to harmful purposes. And secondly, we also use technological tools such as cameras, remote monitoring. There are a lot of nuclear facilities around the world that we monitor remotely through our facilities in our headquarters in Vienna. So we do that. We also take environmental samples in nuclear facilities around the world, which we verify in our laboratories, again, to make sure that there is no diversion of nuclear material away from peaceful applications. Therefore, this system of safeguards provides assurance to the rest of the international community that indeed all the nuclear material is accounted for and that all the nuclear material is in peaceful applications and it is not diverted to harmful applications. The second element of our work that supports non-proliferation is nuclear security. Nuclear security is becoming a big priority of our work. So by nuclear security, essentially, we refer to the physical aspects of ensuring that nuclear facilities around the world are safe, they are secure, so that there is no people who can succeed in taking the nuclear material and using it for nefarious purposes. So in this regard, we help countries using our technical expertise to develop nuclear security plans. So we encourage all countries that have got nuclear material to develop nuclear security plans, and we help them with this. Secondly, we also play a convening role. We convene our member states under our auspices to also develop global nuclear security standards and norms, because this is very important, that there should be predictability in the way in which nuclear material is handled around the world. So this is the second aspect. Therefore, nuclear security is very important. It also contributes to the work of the international community to stop proliferation. The third and last element, perhaps, that I could mention, we also manage a database on the illicit trafficking of nuclear material. So this database is at the IAEA, it's a confidential database, but member states report to us whenever there are threats or trafficking of nuclear material happening. So we share this information with our members on a confidential basis. Nuclear material, you may wonder why I'm talking about nuclear material as if it is in so many places in the world. And this is true. Nuclear material is all over. It is in hospitals. It is in universities used for research. It is in industrial applications. It is sometimes in agriculture, in health facilities. So that's why, therefore, we have to have a big footprint using safeguards, using nuclear security measures, and using the illicit trafficking database to make sure that we can give assurance and confidence to the international community that all nuclear material is in safe hands.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for that excellent crash course on the role of the IAEA and how the agency accomplishes its technical and vital mission. I want to move over now to Dr. Murray. Some of your most recent analysis and research has focused on emerging technology of the kind that I alluded to in my introduction, including the risks that might arise when technology like artificial intelligence becomes intertwined with nuclear weapons and nuclear command and control systems. Can you share some of your thinking on these increasingly odd couplings between emerging technologies and nuclear weapons, which have been around for 70 years? What role in particular should international institutions play in addressing these developments?
Well, thank you, and thank you all for attending this very important session and attending the entire day. AI gets right to the heart of what you were saying about the third nuclear age here in terms of technology intermixing with nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. And just a couple of 2 points up front is one, AI is going to be revolutionizing warfare. And we are in an AI arms race. President Putin has said that this technology will be transformational, and whoever leads in AI will rule the world. President Xi Jinping has laid out a path for China to be a leader in AI by 2030, and has included in the Constitution the legal requirement that any commercial AI be shared with military AI. And as you all know from last week, President Trump has said that the U.S. has to maintain its lead in AI, continue to maintain its lead in AI, and the Pentagon put out its directives on AI research and AI technology and the importance of that. And so we were in an AI arms race, which is also happening at a time when we are at a major crossroad in terms of nuclear arms control and nuclear policy. Over the past, we reached a peak in 1986 of nuclear weapons stockpiles of 70,000 nuclear weapons. Today we're at 15,000 nuclear weapons. And I think this is a transitional time period where those reductions of over 85%, more than 90% of those worldwide stockpiles are US and Russian, where those reductions may actually be taking a turning point, that line may be actually turning up due to the weakening of arms control, technology, and also changes in nuclear strategy. So it is hard to predict, since AI is so nascent, what the impact of AI will be, both positive and negative. But there is one area, and this is the area of command and control, where it raises some very serious concerns, and we have history to look back to as to why we should be concerned, and why AI combined with command and control is a very serious issue that we need to be dealing with now in terms of stability. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, as David Hoffman wrote in his book, The Dead Hand, After the Soviet Union collapsed, it became clear from interviews in Russia as well as the Soviet archives that the Russians actually had a secret command and control system that they originally were going to completely automate. And if they were under attack, if they had been attacked by the United States, and if their command and control, if the Kremlin had gone down, they were considering putting into place a completely automated system called the perimeter system or dead hand. They eventually put in a low-level military official who, so there was a human control at the very end of this process if it was found that the command and control had been knocked out. But they had considered completely automated based on computer assessments that they had lost their command and control. And it was secret, so this wasn't done as a deterrent to assure the U.S. that there would be a retaliatory response. This was just to assure that the Soviet Union would be retaliating. Combine that with advanced AI, we have the potential that we may be moving into an era where it's considered by the Russians, by the US, or by the Chinese, or by the other nuclear powers to actually move to an automated, if you have the confidence in an artificial intelligence system, move to a completely automated command and control response to a nuclear attack, which would be extremely dangerous and extremely destabilizing. And what's interesting is that last fall, there was actually a interview in the Russian magazine Zveta with the former head in the 1990s of the Russian strategic forces, who said that perimeter, or dead hand, was actually functioning and improved. So this is a continuing threat that may, possibility or threat that may be out there. What does improved mean? So there's an urgency here. The Pentagon, the U.S. Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense actually has a directive in terms of AI that there will always be human interaction with AI systems. That's not clear in terms of Russia. It's also not clear in terms of China, how are they thinking about artificial intelligence and command and control. And there's been some indication from one of the senior officials in one of their defense industries that there's a potential for AI to completely take over human command and control of, he was talking about overall defense policy systems. So there's a real serious issue here, and what could be done about it? The UN, for example, is actually looking at artificial intelligence and lethal artificial weapons. And it's under the UN Conference for Certain Conventional Weapons. And I would just make the suggestion that we ought to be considering, on an international level, looking at the aspects of nuclear weapons, nuclear command and control, which we know, as I said, is an immediate issue that needs to be addressed, and start looking at that through the UN as we look at the other impacts of artificial intelligence on weapon systems. As well as, I think it's very important that this becomes an aspect of strategic stability talks between the U.S., Russia, China, in particular, since we are advancing very quickly in AI.
Thank you so much for that overview. It really sounds like some of this, brings together Dr. Strangelove and Terminator in a way. So these are critical issues that I hope we devote more attention to.
And unfortunately, it's a little bit real life with dead hand and perimeter.
Exactly. So moving forward, the 20th century was really, the second half of the 20th century was really the 50 years of nuclear testing, beginning in July 1945 with the American test of the first bomb at the Trinity test site, all the way to the breakout of India and Pakistan in 1998. We had years of atmospheric nuclear testing. That concluded in October 1980 with China's last test. And in the 21st century so far, depending on your perspective, we've either been unlucky enough or lucky enough to just have seen one state conduct 6 nuclear detonations, North Korea. North Korea says that it's now completed its nuclear testing and won't need to conduct further detonations. So Carlos, I wanted to ask you, to the role of youth in disarmament and in stopping nuclear weapons explosions more generally. In a way, we might have an opportunity now with the North Koreans saying that they're done with their nuclear testing, and maybe we don't have to see further nuclear weapons detonations. So what's the most important thing in your view that youth can contribute to sustaining momentum on something like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is yet to enter into force? And how can we go about bringing support for this treaty among those countries that continue to be opposed to it almost intractably?
Well, thank you, Ankit. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about an issue that's near and dear to my heart, and that I hope you will be able to take away, learning a little bit more about the impacts of nuclear testing and why it's important for us to take the lead in raising awareness about why we need to move towards a world free from nuclear explosions. The biggest risk that we face as a generation is the risk of forgetting. You know, we didn't grow up under the shadow of the Cold War. Our parents might have done duck and cover drills in elementary school, but that's not an experience that we had. And so when we think about nuclear testing, it seems like it's a relic of a bygone era, and it's an abstract problem that we can't impact, but that's really the furthest thing from the truth. And for me, what I find, the CTBTO Youth Group was an initiative that was launched by Dr. Lizina Zerbo, the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. It's headquartered in Vienna, the organization, and Dr. Zerbo saw that there was a need for young people to have a seat at the table and to be able to contribute to the dialogue and to the discussion related to nuclear weapons, nuclear testing, because it's our world. We're going to be the ones that are going to be living in it in the future, and we need to make sure that the future that we live in the future is shared in terms of prosperity and of security. So when it comes to the CTBT, that's a treaty that was opened for signature a little bit over 20 years ago, and it implements a prohibition on nuclear testing. But what I really admire the most about the treaty is that it's not just words on paper. It's set up a system, a verification regime that monitors the world 24/7 for signs of nuclear explosions. And it's a network of 337 stations that are using cutting-edge technology, seismic, radionuclide, infrasound, and hydroacoustic sensors to detect around the world when a nuclear explosion takes place. And the goal of this verification regime is to ensure that if a country violates the test ban treaty, the international community will know that a violation has taken place. And this treaty helps keep us safe here in the United States. And so when I think about what youth can do, I think it's important to raise awareness and talk about the value that such a system can bring for our communities here at home. And one short story that I'll share, the CTBTO Youth Group organized in the fall of last year a conference in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, when it was part of the Soviet Union, was home to the Soviet Union's nuclear test site called Semipalatinsk. And as part of our visit, we went out and took a 14-hour train ride to visit Semipalatinsk. And when we got there and set foot on the nuclear test site, it was shocking to see the effects and the impacts of nuclear explosions over the course of the latter half of the 20th century. So seeing the devastating impact that this has and knowing that it's not an abstract problem but one that affects us here at home has really made me value the impact that you and I can have when we raise our voices together to speak about the importance of moving towards a world free from nuclear testing. Great. So now moving a bit to current events, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of questions about this, but I want to talk a bit about North Korea now. Ambassador, I want to come back to you. The United Nations has, of course, played a critical role with regard to North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, everywhere from the Security Council to the panel of experts to the Sanctions Committee here. And in a few short days, as I said at the beginning, President Trump will meet Kim Jong-un in Vietnam for another summit, potentially to discuss the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, from your perspective, what should we be looking for at this summit? And what role might the IAEA play in any potential agreement on limiting or capping North Korea's arsenal that might emerge from the summit?
Thank you. Regarding the DPRK, we as the IAA, we welcome the ongoing talks, the summit that was held in Singapore, as well as the one that is going to take place in a few days. And we are particularly, of course, interested in the aspects of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This would be a very important step forward for the whole international community. For the IAA has not been physically present in the DPRK since 2009. So from 2009 up to today, we have not been physically inspecting the DPRK nuclear program. We have, of course, been following the progression and the development of the nuclear program of the DPRK using open source information, satellite imagery, and information from many other sources that we, of course, distill using our own processes to come up with our own independent analysis. So the role of the IAA, therefore, we foresee that we would be in a position, we think we are the only international organization, in any case, that would be in a position to do the actual verification of the DPRK denuclearization. So we are ready to play this role. We have in our headquarters in Vienna, we have already created a DPRK team, what we refer to as the DPRK team. This is a team of experts who have knowledge of the DPRK nuclear program. Some of them are people who worked in the DPRK before 2009. So they have knowledge. They have also been following the developments in the DPRK over the years, even though we are not physically present. So we are ready. Our Director General has actually said that we would be in a position as the IAA to go into the DPRK, not in weeks, not in months, but in a matter of days. So that is basically our commitment and our state of readiness. Of course, this will depend on the political agreement. Similar to the case of the JCPOA with Iran, the IAA was not part of the actual negotiations of the deal. That was between the 5 countries and Iran. So, but once they taken a decision that they would want the IAA to follow up and verify the implementation, then we are ready to do that. So that will be our role as well, should there be an agreement amongst the concerned parties that the IAA should come and play a role. So in a nutshell, we are ready. We believe that we have the expertise to verify any denuclearization that would be taking place in that part of the world.
Thank you. Well, I think we've seen reports that DPRK's facilities at Yongbyon might be on the table at the upcoming summit, so fingers crossed we'll get something for the IAA to work on there again. Dr. Murray, coming back to you and coming back to the issue of arms control specifically, at the beginning of this month, the United States formally notified that it will withdraw from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty after Russia allegedly committed a violation of that treaty that the U.S. made public first in 2014. Now, INF was an incredible treaty. It resulted in the destruction of 2,692 ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. It banned their possession by these two countries across the world indefinitely. And now with that treaty gone, what do you see as the primary effects on international security? Russia already has a missile that it's developed that violates this treaty allegedly. The United States has said that now it will go ahead and develop these missiles. How does this affect the global strategic landscape in your view?
I think there are several main reasons how it affects the global landscape, and first and foremost is to what you were just indicating, that we have just lifted the caps off of a ban on an entire class of weapons between 500 and 5,500 kilometers ground-based, either nuclear or conventional ballistic or cruise missiles. We've just, once that ban is lifted, we're really, the first and foremost, we're looking at a new arms race in that area where it's a action-reaction cycle on what we need to, what each side needs to have in order to ensure deterrence, and you get into this action-reaction cycle. So I think first and foremost, we're lifting those caps. 2,600 plus weapons had been dismantled, and we're looking at an arms race. There's another component of this, though. It's not just the numbers. It's also a more destabilizing situation with these weapon systems. And actually, this links to the conversation on artificial intelligence. What prompted the Soviet Union to start the perimeter or dead hand system that would be an almost automatic response to a decapitation of their command, of the Kremlin, was the deployment of these intermediate range systems, the decision to deploy as a response to the Soviet systems, NATO's decision to deploy these systems in 1979 in Europe. That cut the attack time, the launch time, down from 15 or 20 minutes for long-range ballistic missiles to the Kremlin being vulnerable to an attack on its command and control that would be about 5 or 7 minutes. And that led them to rely on an almost automated response. It's really interesting that one of the top analysts at the Russian USA Canada Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences recently was stating that the deployment of these systems again in Europe might actually compel the Russian leadership to rely on the perimeter, on activating the perimeter system again. And so this would be an advanced perimeter system with more advanced technology. And so you're back into this situation where war is going to happen faster, escalation to nuclear weapons is going to happen faster, the threat of attacks on command and control are going to be taken even more seriously, and you get into a situation where the use of nuclear weapons in terms of preemptive strikes, again, is back on the table in a more enhanced and accelerated level. And so it's not only an arms race in terms of numbers, it's an arms race in terms of a more destabilizing situation. The other impact of this that's very important is I think it really is going to undermine the ability to achieve further arms control. And obviously, the biggest issue on the table is the New START Treaty expires in 2021. And the New START Treaty brought us to an historic level, low level, of 1,500 deployed nuclear warheads on these longer range systems, each, 1,550 between the U.S. and Russia. Major, major reductions in these systems under the START process. That's up for either extension or a follow-on agreement or a collapse, an end of that process in 2021. And I think the undermining of the arms control process, the concern that Russia has cheated on INF, really undermines the acceleration in these weapon systems that have been banned. I think undermines the efforts in terms of further arms control. And then you also have the impact this will have in the future on weakening the NATO alliance. Right now, NATO is very much supportive of the U.S. decision, completely agrees that Russia has been cheating on the agreement, and U.S. and NATO is cohesive. Once you start looking at deploying future weapons systems, it gets much more controversial, especially if you're going to go into ground-based systems, where are you going to put them and which countries will host them? And so you will see a division in NATO, not only in terms of deploying U.S. systems, who takes them, but also a division within NATO where Poland, for instance, said that they would be willing to take these systems, where Germany has said that really isn't the solution for the future. So there will be several really important ramifications of the INF withdrawal.
Also, turning 180 degrees from there, we just heard a vision of how arms control might collapse and nuclear stockpiles might increase. I wanted to sort of flip things around a bit, Carlos, and ask you about another international effort. We've talked a bit about the NPT, we've talked about the CTBT, and we have a new treaty now, a treaty prohibiting the possession of nuclear weapons. This was accomplished following a remarkable bout of negotiations here at the United Nations. And no one really knows where this treaty is going to take us in about 5 to 10 years' time. And I think there's questions about how the treaty can coexist with the NPT regime. and how it can actually realize its vision of the universal disarmament of a world without nuclear weapons and ban these weapons from ever being possessed again by any country. So what's your perspective on this treaty, and where do you think it's really going to take us?
Well, the TPNW it kind of spells out the ultimate goal of the United Nations in terms of eliminating nuclear weapons, but that's a journey that's far off, and it begins with a single step. And when I look at the state of the arms control environment right now, I see the CTBT, the Test Ban Treaty, as that first step, because you have to ban nuclear explosions first. So what excites me about the CTBT is the fact that it's almost a universal treaty. It's got over 180 signatory states and 168 ratifications by member states. The last one was just in recent days, within the last week. Zimbabwe deposited their instrument of ratification right here in New York. Last year we had Thailand ratify the treaty, and Vanuatu signed it as well. So it gives me hope that there's a movement on the CTBT, and there's desire from the international community to reap the benefits of the international monitoring system and of that verification regime. And what also gives me a little bit of hope, you mentioned optimism. We heard from the Secretary-General that one of the biggest threats in a response to a gentleman's question from Maryland, he responded that the undermining of nuclear non-proliferation was one of the biggest challenges that we face today and that the United Nations faces. But when I look back and I look at the folks in the CTBTO youth group, and I see their excitement and their passion for this topic, for moving forward and making progress and contributing their voice to the dialogue, it gives me hope that we can move towards that end goal, and that together, when we speak out, there's actions that we can take in our communities to make sure that we end with a world free from nuclear testing.
All right, great. So I want to thank all our panelists for that excellent moderated discussion. And with that, I'd also like to now open it up for questions from the audience. Please just raise your hands, and I'll call on you one at a time. So we'll start right here.
Great. Thank you all so much for your great work. My name is Ari Eisenstadt. I'm pursuing a PhD in future studies at the University of Hawaii, which is still traumatized from the missile alert. In looking at future studies, I'm wondering if you all could share what the best case scenario would be and what the process of the world powers coming together and getting rid of nuclear weapons would look like. Thank you.
So trying to be optimistic, I'm going to start with a little bit of a pessimistic assessment. I actually think, and I think the work that you're doing, Carlos, and your interest, as well as the work being done at the UN, we're actually at a crossroads right now, and we are either going to head down a much more destabilizing path. I mean, we've got the challenges, as I said, of arms control, weakening, the arms control regime's weakening. We have the challenges of technology, challenging stability, and the competition among the main powers, U.S., Russia, China, as well as the proliferation threats of North Korea and the potential threat of Iran, really pushing us at this major turning point, and we're either going to head back up an upward slope, or, to get to your optimistic, how do we turn this around? And I think it's really a combination of several major factors. And first and foremost, though, is you can't dismiss, looking at the history of nuclear weapons and nuclear arms control, the absolute critical importance of public engagement, and how public engagement really did help push the arms control and the stability agenda. And so I really think that in order move governments by moving people, people move governments. And the most obvious example, since we're talking about INF, is the major protests that happened in Europe when the decision to deploy ground-based systems was made, and the public really pushing the issue that governments really better find an answer to this problem, because these systems in Europe were not the answer that they wanted. And without that public support and public push, I think we wouldn't have had the successes we've had to date. And as I say, we're at a turning point, and the problem is, as Carlos has mentioned, we haven't, at least in the United States, I feel very comfortable saying that the American public has not really thought about nuclear weapons or the nuclear problem, as well as analysts. We're kind of fleeing from the nuclear issues after the collapse of the Soviet Union because the problem went away. Our major threat went away. And the weapon systems were reducing. And the U.S. was reducing the role of nuclear weapons, and in agreements we're reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons. And so the issue has gone away, and without the knowledge, you're not going to get the public interest, and without the public push, I don't think we'll get this turning in the right direction, both here and in Russia and in China, I mean, around the world.
She hit it right on the head. She hit it right on the head when she talked about in terms of public engagement. It's going to take you, each one of you, raising your voice and taking action within your community, because global change starts at a local level. And it's the sum of small actions, steps in the right direction, and it's almost like moving or walking on one of those moving carpets at the airport, except in the opposite direction. If you stand still and you don't do anything, you're going to move backwards. And you have to continue taking steps, moving forward against the current to make sure that these threats are reduced. And that's what I have really enjoyed from the youth group is being around individuals that are passionate about taking those actions and that want to get involved. So to any of you that want to be a part of the solution, I invite you to take part in this journey with us and start that step today.
Terrific. Let's continue the Q&A. And if you want to direct your question, by the way, to a specific speaker, just say so when you ask the question. So let's go right here.
Yes. Hi, my name is Steve Brandt. I'm from New York City. Actually came here when I was 7 years old, 57 years ago. And world peace has been part of my DNA ever since. My question is on the shoulders of the gentleman from Hawaii. Public engagement, especially Lori perhaps, how can the Council on Foreign Relations be a force for new thinking on the question? See, I come from the engineering world, and design thinking is part of what we use. Nuclear weapons exist as a symptom of a larger cultural disease. We think we need to fight, and then we develop ways to fight because we think we need to fight. Buckminster Fuller, over 50 years ago, wrote Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, and he showed through science that the root cause of war, scarcity of resources and thinking there have to be winners and losers on a global level, was no longer scientifically true. That kind of thinking, that the way to solve the problems of the weapons of war is to have a public dialogue engaging people on the question of whether war is actually perhaps scientifically obsolete. We can solve our problems without fighting. That's what Bucky wrote about over 50 years ago. And so I'm looking for ways to engage people on this question of whether the weapons issue is actually a subset of a larger cultural conversation we need to have. Can we use science to advance beyond the need to settle our differences violently? I believe we can have that breakthrough but we've got to find a place where we can talk about it. I mean, you know, they made a movie called The Day After in the 1980s, and that energized people in America to get Ronald Reagan to stop talking like he was going to use nuclear weapons. Do you remember the movie The Day After? Brilliant, ABC television. So I'd like to find a way to engage this larger design question. Do we have the potential to have a culture where weapons are actually no longer seen as necessary because we learn how to solve our differences without fighting? Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right. And actually, today, the United Nations Association there is an important forum where these discussions to take place. I will say I hope I'm part of the new thinking on how to think about these problems at the Council on Foreign Relations. That's just a small role. And in terms of a larger role, I would say this is the most fascinating time to be involved in arms control and non-proliferation. That we've been talking, or I in particular have been talking about the dark side of the problems that we have to be careful about, think thoroughly about now that we can see in terms of technology and destabilization. But these same technologies, AI and the verification technologies, how it's going to improve verification, and verification has been accelerating. Our abilities to accelerate the verification processes because of the advances in technology, and AI is going to contribute to that even more. Even just crowdsourcing in terms of just using digital technology and social media in terms of verification, just on the simplest level. But what is happening in what the advances in technology can actually provide major breakthroughs in how we think about arms control and nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and on a whole range of issues on the stabilizing side. And the more you know about what's going on around the world, and that's AI and command and control, the more you can see the battlefield, the more you can try and prevent, not the problem is you might want to preempt, but you could also prevent conflict from happening because you can see it popping up much more quickly. So this is an absolutely fascinating time. And if I was going into a PhD program, I would, I wish I was going into a PhD program again now, which is hard to say having come out of a PhD program, but and for those of you who may be in it. But it is an absolutely fascinating time because there is such an opportunity for new thinking that these technologies are presenting.
I'll just add, I mean, on the cultural front, I mean, a lot's happening here in the United States on this issue. We've seen lawmakers put forward bills calling for the United States to adopt a no first use posture. That's very much on the cultural side of how we think about and conceive of the role of nuclear weapons in American strategy. And I think those debates are really happening. So if you can engage yourself in those debates, I think that's a good way to move forward the conversation and potentially shift the cultural role of these weapons. So let's continue the Q&A. Let's go over here in the front row. Right here? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Anton Stalchek, University of Maryland. I'm a student at the University of Maryland, majoring in Central European, Russian, Eurasian Studies. My question to all speakers, which steps should be taken by the nuclear states to decrease their nuclear arsenal without putting their national security into a jeopardy? Thank you.
Well, I'd like to flip that question around and in terms of when you think about what countries can do on a smaller scale, I mean, it's just a collection of individuals, and you are just as important a member of this country as the people that are in political office right now. So you have a voice that you can use to make sure that when you want to raise this issue, go and talk to your congressman, reach out in your district and talk to elected officials about what your views are on this specific policy. And when you take those actions at a local level, you can end up having an impact on the policy down the line.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. We'll go back there. Yep.
Hi there. Thanks for calling on me all the way back here. My question is in regard to kind of the future. We've seen that sanctions and other responses to North Korea haven't been very effective. Maybe Vietnam will change that. And so I'm wondering, once we see nuclear missile tests, how can the UN better respond to prevent or de-incentivize countries from continuing those? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, besides the agreements between big powers, as we have been talking about the INF and the other treaties, there are other treaties that are almost of a universal nature, and I think the cornerstone for disarmament and non-proliferation is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And under the NPT, obviously, there are undertakings that have been made by both the nuclear weapon states as well as the non-nuclear weapon states. And I think the big elephant in the room is obviously political will regarding all these treaties, whether it is the bilateral agreements between the US and the Russian Federation or a global multilateral treaty. Ultimately, we do require political will from states and from political leaders to go through and implement their undertakings. I can't say much about the sanctions and those other elements, except to say that, we, as I said before, we welcome any steps or agreements that are going to be reached pertaining to denuclearization and therefore stopping spread of nuclear weapons. And we will be ready to play a part to verify that.
I would actually take a little bit of issue with your conclusion that sanctions haven't worked, and I would actually make the opposite argument. I think the international community coming together, the support of China, the support of Russia, even though the sanctions haven't been fully abided by, the pressure that the international community through the UN Security Council has put on North Korea has actually been successful with the missile, in the sense that the missile tests have stopped, the nuclear weapon testing has stopped, temporarily, but it has, and hopefully in perpetuity, but it has stopped, has brought the North Koreans to the table, has brought Kim Jong-un to the table to discuss these issues. So I would actually make the argument that international pressure, working together as an international community, has actually moved the ball forward. I also think the North Korea example is really instructive in terms of the nuclear weapons issue, which actually gets back to the larger cultural question that was brought up earlier, which is that if you look at what's actually happening in the discussions, both at the summit level and among the special advisors on these issues, is that it's broader than denuclearization. It's about transforming the relationship between the U.S. and the DPRK. It's about a peace agreement, turning the truce into peace on the a real peace agreement on the peninsula, as well as returning American remains from the Korean War. It's really about a stability and security question regarding North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and then providing the ability for North Korea to feel safe and secure enough to get rid of its nuclear weapons and also recognize that its future is actually more prosperous without them.
Well, thank you so much. And with that, unfortunately, we're out of time today. We could talk about these issues for several days, I'm sure. But I really want to thank our excellent panelists, each for their contributions. And thanks to all of you for coming today.
Hello, everyone. Before everyone heads off to lunch, I have some important instructions for you. For lunch, if you leave the UN premises, give yourself an hour for lunch, but at least 30 minutes to get back in, because once again, it will take you time. Make sure you take your grounds pass. You cannot enter the UN without it, so make sure you have it. And if you need any restaurant recommendations, please go to unausa.org and go to the Global Engagement Summit website, and the session will begin at 1:40 will be the next session. Thank you.